Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight. I'm Juliana Ranches, and I'm Assistant Professor, Beef Extension Specialist with Oregon State University. It's my pleasure to be organizing this webinar series. Our goal with this webinar series is to provide information and discuss about wildfires with focus on preparedness prior to fire season, how to care for livestock during and after smoke exposure. So this webinar series is actually part of a large project funded by USDA NIFA, which focuses on understanding how smoke exposure from wildfires actually affects animal health and production. This is actually the second edition of this webinar series, and this week our goal is to bring a little bit of update on what we've been doing since the last year we got together. Yesterday we had a great update on dairy research with Dr. Ames Hibel and Dr. Pedro Rezaman from University of Idaho. And tonight for our second evening together, we have Dr. Katie Wollstein, Dr. Katie Wollstein, Rangeland Fire Specialist with Oregon State University. Katie will be talking about fire season preparedness and probably with a little bit more focus on landowners and how those people can work to prepare for the fire season. As we always know, questions will be answered at the end of the webinar, and you can use the Q&A box to ask your questions. I guess with that, Katie, thank you very much, and the screen is yours. Thank you.
Thanks, Juliana. So, and thanks for the nice introduction. And so for those of you who have been keeping up with the research of this group, my talk tonight is more about how to reduce the likelihood that your livestock are exposed to smoke to begin with. We might talk a little bit about, what happens if you are affected by fire. But that's where we are today. And so just to get going, I know it's a small group, but I work with a lot of ranchers. I really like to hear what you all are doing, whether you're in Eastern Oregon, whether you're elsewhere. Are there any things that you currently do to prepare your ranch, your property for fire season? If anything at all, please share in the chat. I'm going to put my small thing in there. Just take a second. Oh, it looks like our chat is disabled. Sorry, everyone.
I was going to say that now. Sorry, Katie. I think they could maybe do on the Q&A box if they want to enter something.
Sure. So if you're feeling moved to share tonight, I'd love to hear that. And so really there is no right answer as long as it's something, right? Thinking about fire season is coming and things that we do prior to when the fire arrives can only help us be more prepared. And so today, let's see if I can get those slides to advance. There we go. I'm going to just start by talking a little bit about what drives fire and really what is within our control, as landowners, as people who live on fire-prone landscapes. And so focusing on fuel management options in particular, so land management practices that can help set us up for a less devastating fire season in a lot of cases. And then we'll talk about preparing your ranch for fire season. And so that it might include making a plan and also perhaps how to report a wildfire when you come upon one. And so briefly, and if some of you have seen previous years of our work, I like to just talk about, this looks like a complicated figure, but what drives fire? It's super important to be aware of day-to-day conditions during fire season. Weather, we'll talk about that a lot. Maybe you want to limit your activities that risk starting a fire. Topography, where your ranch is relative to, some slope. Where it might be difficult to respond to fire. It might determine how quickly a fire might reach your property or your assets, or whether an evacuation route is viable. But we really can't control these things. What can we control? It's just fuels. And so today we're going to talk about what are called fuel characteristics, which gives us information about how fire is expected to behave, how likely fire is when there's an ignition, how extreme that fire behavior might be, how quickly that fire might move. This can also tell us something about the burn severity, and so that tells you something about the ecological outcomes if you were to have a fire on your property. And furthermore, if you really want to get into it, it can also tell us something about the frequency of fire following that initial fire event. And so we care about fuels because managing fuels can limit the risk we might be exposing our properties, our assets, our livelihoods to. And so just really quickly, what is fuel? Again, some of you may have seen this with me before. On rangelands, and I'm in southeastern Oregon, so we're talking about sagebrush rangelands. Our fuels are fairly basic. We're mostly talking about what are called fine fuels, which are grasses, so both perennial bunch grasses and then also invasive annual grasses, which we'll talk a lot about. And then woody fuels. And so those are going to be your shrubs, your sagebrush, your rabbit brush. We also have a lot of western juniper on this landscape. And simply put, fine fuels are the things that very readily ignite, and they are very good at spreading fire across the landscape. And then in contrast, our woody fuels are the ones that are going to burn maybe hotter or longer and increase things like fire intensity and subsequent burn severity. And so we'll talk about a couple fuel characteristics that, put together, tell us a little something about expected fire behavior. So how likely fire is, what it does when it happens, and again, those consequences of fire. And so the first fuel characteristic I wanted to briefly talk about is just fuel arrangement. And so you might hear about fuel continuity, fuel loading. And so fuel load, fuel bed depth, it's really significant for predicting whether a fire will be ignited, its rate of spread, its intensity. And so on rangelands, especially when we have really wet years, it's great when the grass grows. But if that grass remains on that landscape for multiple years, we start to get quite a fuel load. And what that means is when there's an ignition, there's a pretty high likelihood that that ignition will strike readily ignitable fuel. A fire will start, that fire will spread. Burning fuels that are in direct contact with the ground can mean more heat penetration into the soil. If you're someone who does pile burning on your property, you've seen this, and so you know that underneath that pile, you might have a much harder time rehabilitating that spot than the surrounding areas on your property. In these two photos here, these demonstrate two different fuel loads. Doesn't help that one's in the green season, one, those fuels are cured. But in general, I think we can all agree that that top photo where things are green, it has a relatively lower fuel load than that bottom one. You can see how there's an awful lot of grass packed into a relatively small area on the bottom photo in contrast to the top one. The other feature of fuel arrangement that's of interest to us, especially in rangelands where we're growing grass, is the spatial arrangement of the fuels. And so this is in reference to continuity. And so horizontal fuel continuity, that's how something like grass connects fire across the landscape. And so when we have something like the perennial bunch grasses in that photo up top, you can see the bare soil in between those grasses that we call those inner spaces. And so unless it's a really windy day, which yes, we do get, you can imagine that fire will less readily spread from bunch grass to bunch grass, in contrast to that lower photo where each piece of grass is literally touching. And so fire can really readily move through a fuel bed. The other type of fuel arrangement that might be relevant if you have a little bit of timber or forest on your property is vertical fuel arrangement. And so a lot of you may have heard the term ladder fuels. And so this is just bridging the gap between a surface fire and the canopy. And so if you have this lower photo here, those low-hanging juniper branches are actually touching the grass there. And so those actually serve as ladder fuels to move a ground fire into the canopy of the tree. And once the fire's in the canopy of trees or the canopy of sagebrush, embers can be readily picked up by winds and actually spread fire long distances. And so that's why we worry about vertical continuity. It can make just fire response pretty challenging, and we'll talk about that a little more in a bit. The next fuel characteristic I wanted to talk about a little is fuel moisture. And so this is pretty straightforward. Again, a lot of you are growing grass on your property. And so, you know, when it's green, there's more water in that grass than when it's brown. And so it makes a lot of sense when there's higher moisture content. That piece of fuel requires more heat for that piece of fuel to ignite and then burn. And this is influenced by environmental conditions and also other fuel characteristics. And so as far as environmental conditions go, the obvious one, has it rained recently? The other thing is sun heats air and fuels. This lowers the moisture content, it cures fuels, it makes those fuels closer to that point, again, where when there's a heat source, they're gonna ignite. And so the environmental condition that's relevant for that is actually going to be aspect. And so if you have some topography on your property, you've probably seen north facing slopes. They tend to have a lot more vegetation. That's because they're more moist, they have more shade. And so again, they have heavier fuels, but lower temperatures, higher humidity. And so in general, they're going to have higher fuel moistures. And so fire burns differently on north and south slopes. Next time you drive through a canyon or a draw, and perhaps there's been a fire there in recent years, you can actually see that the fire behavior was quite different on a north versus south facing slope. Fuel type. So I mentioned other fuel characteristics can influence fuel moisture. So is it live or dead fuel? And so live fuel are living plants, things that are still green. And so the time of the year is a big factor for this when it comes to grass. So height of the growing season is when we have the highest fuel moisture. And then this decreases through the fire season as our grasses cure. The other fuel condition or fuel characteristic that might be relevant here is just that fine versus woody fuels. So this probably doesn't surprise anyone here. Those herbaceous fuels, those grasses, they dry out faster as fire season progresses because they hold less moisture. They have a larger surface area to volume ratio. There's less surface exposed to the environment for moisture loss, and it takes longer to dry out in the cases of our heavy woody fuels. And so for us, invasive annual grasses dry out much earlier than native bunch grasses in Eastern Oregon. And so a lot of you are probably familiar with kind of that purpley looking cheatgrass this time of year. It's starting to get brown. And the reason we worry about these grasses drying out earlier, so first off, studies have found that native perennial bunch grasses stay green longer than invasive annual grasses by 3 weeks. What this means is if you have a pasture that's dominated by invasive annual grasses, your fire season is functionally 3 weeks longer. Your fuel bed in that pasture is receptive to ignition and burning 3 weeks earlier than if it were a perennial bunch grass community. And so we know it's hard to change what convert annuals back to, convert annuals back to perennials. But just being aware of the hazards that a really flammable pasture bring is something that we're shooting for. The other thing, well, so this figure is from some of Kirk Davies' work a few years ago. And as you can see, you know, in general, these are grasses. So those dark circles are a cheatgrass invaded site. Those open circles, that top line, is this kind of intact perennial bunch grass community that I mentioned. And so, yes, for both grass species, again, because they're fine fuels, their water content does drastically decrease as we get further into fire season, moving to July to August. But you can see that that top line, the perennial bunch grass community, the water content does stay fairly high, considerably longer than that cheatgrass dominated site. The next fuel characteristic I wanted to talk about was chemical composition. This is really what we're thinking about when we talk about reducing hazardous fuels to modify fire behavior, make it so we can improve fire response in these areas. And so some fuels are just more volatile than others. Their leaves contain oil, wax, pitch. And when we have these really volatile fuels, juniper, sagebrush, where we are, this increases the rate of spread. So fires are going to move more quickly. They're putting off a lot of embers. We're going to see longer flame lengths, which again makes direct tactics difficult if you're a wildland firefighter. And this also increases fire intensity. And so we don't want wildland firefighters right on that fire line. They're going to be doing some kind of indirect tactics further away from the fire. And so juniper in particular is known to produce pretty large flames. And so this is a photo from one of my project sites in the Stinking Water Mountains in Harney County. And this road that I'm standing on where I took this photo was a proposed control location for if there were to be a fire in this area. And so you can see in the foreground of the photo, all of the heavy fuels have been removed. The roadside vegetation is mostly grass. And then as you can see ahead, there's a heavy juniper stand. This was proposed for treatment, and you can imagine why. So knowing what we do about the chemical composition of juniper fuel type, we can expect some really large flames, some really intense fire if those junipers were to burn. And so this road would not be an option for deploying firefighting resources because they wouldn't want to be anywhere near that fire. And so thinking about places on your property that might look like this are something to consider. And we'll talk about this once I talk about things you can do to manage risk in your property. And so just to summarize this section about fuels and how that might influence fire behavior. So we started with fuel loading. And so when there's a lot of fuel in an area, and so we talked about how grass might pile up year after year, we would expect that there's an increase in the likelihood that ignition will start a fire. And then a lot of times we see more fire intensity just because there's a lot of fuel, a lot of energy being released from that fuel bed. Likewise, when we have higher fuel continuity, and so that was that photo where the cured grasses were really packed in, each piece of grass was touching one another. And so in instances like that, we would expect an increased rate of spread. Fire can readily move across a landscape as opposed to having to work really hard or get a lot of wind jumping from bunch grass to bunch grass. We also spent some time talking about fuel moisture. And so when that is lower relative to other fuels, that fuel bed is more flammable. That's pretty intuitive. And so this also means there's a higher likelihood that when there's an ignition, a fire will start. And then it's also known to increase the rate of fire spread because again, all those fuels are closer to that ignition point. Less heat needs to be applied for them to start burning. And then lastly, this is about chemical composition, which we just went over. When we have highly volatile fuels, so like those sagebrush and juniper, we know that they're going to burn longer, they're going to burn hotter. And so a lot of times, and I didn't go over this, this increases the burn severity in the immediate area of those fuels. And so what that means is following fire, when we want to be doing post-fire rehabilitation, those sites might be a little bit difficult to restore. Either the seed bank has been scorched by prolonged heat being applied to the soil, or the soil has just been neutralized. There are nutrients in that area to nurture germination. And so the next thing if nothing else, I'd really like you to take home these ideas today. So managing fuels, so thinking about how these characteristics interact on different places on your property. This can influence how likely fire is, how that fire behaves, and again, the potential outcomes of that fire. And so for the next few minutes, I'm going to share a little bit of ideas for modifying those fuel characteristics that we just talked about to address things like the flammability of important places on your property or reducing fire behavior in important places so that fire response can be highly effective at stopping those fires. And so the first of these, just reducing fuel load. So I think if you're at this webinar, you might have livestock that you graze on the landscape. And so multiple studies have found that proper grazing can reduce wildfire risk. It can promote the resilience of plant communities. And this is fairly straightforward, and you can see this in the figure. Grazing literally removes biomass from the landscape. And so we talked about high fuel loads, grass accumulating season after season. If there's less grass there, then there's less energy, less fuel to first ignite, and then also less energy in that fuel bed. Less fine fuel means a lower likelihood of ignition. The other thing is that in grazed areas, when there is interspaces or reduced fuels in between plants, and so here the dark bars are grazed, the light bars are ungrazed, you actually just have lower fire temperature in general. And so think of that photo I showed of the bare interspaces in between the perennial bunch grasses. You have more of a meandering fire rather than a fire if there were high horizontal fuel continuity or just a high fuel load because it hadn't been grazed, a fire continuously going through an area. And so lower burn temperatures are associated with less negative fire outcomes. And so I talked a little bit about how prolonged heat in the soil can negatively affect the seed bank. And so we, might see some fairly positive effects of these lower temperature fires. They're clearing off the duff, the litter, and if the seed bank's intact, you might get some good grass growth the following growing season. And related to this, grazing has also been found to create more unburned patches. And so here, the control, so ungrazed, and then the pink bar, green bar, yellow bar, were all different grazing treatments across a couple years. And just in general, you can see that increased grazing, so yellow being the most intense in this study, was associated with lower spread probability. And again, this just goes back to grazing literally removes fuel from the landscape. And so it just makes it more difficult for fire to move through a fuel bed. And so grazing interrupts fuel continuity. But the other thing we'd like to be thinking about is how annual grasses create a whole lot of fuel continuity. And so how can we address annual grasses in these areas? So invasive annual grasses, medusa head, cheatgrass, ventonata, they increase the probability that if there's ignition, fire will start and that fire will spread. And so monitoring, so knowing where you have invasives and making sure that they stay in that area is a really effective first step. So options for that, if you know you have a patch of invasives in a place, you might want to reduce vehicle, animal, human contact with the seeds, brush off your boots and clothing. I know it's hard if you're grazing these fields, and so if you can, don't move livestock directly from an infested field to an uninvaded area. Ideally, your rotation might hit those infested sites perhaps before seed drop so that you can make a dent in the seed bank. The cheatgrass, for example, cows will eat it while it's still green. And then you'll want to maintain invasive annual grass-free zones along roads and trails. So again, there aren't vector pathways for them to spread. And so this will likely involve using herbicides. You might want to use a selective herbicide pre-emergent in the fall. Will minimize damage to your perennials because they aren't germinating in the fall. You could try prescribed burning in the fall, but you would absolutely want to treat it with an herbicide and reseed after the burn so that that area isn't just recolonizing. Another trick some people try is seeding around infestations just to reduce the spread. And so seeding with a species that can compete with cheatgrass, so crested wheatgrass has been known to do that, could be a good option for just keeping your infestation contained. You'll want to continue to survey your property. So invasive annual grasses are a reality in a lot of the West. And so surveying your property and just having it be a practice. So concentrating along roads, animal trails, maybe you have some random monitoring locations. And, like I said, keep an eye out near your existing infestations. Have they spread? Are there recently disturbed areas where susceptibility to invasion is greater? And so those new infestations, you might want to target those for eradication. And so routinely monitoring is a good option, at least in the immediate term, for dealing with invasive annual grasses so that they don't take hold and exclude perennial grasses. Like in this photo here, which I took in southern Idaho. In the long term, we want to be thinking about maintaining or increasing plant community resistance to invasion. This is a tricky thing. Some sites are just prone to invasives. These are our warm, dry sites, usually lower elevation, around 5,000 feet and below. And so, due to soil type and other things, it just makes those sites vulnerable to invasives. And so again, preventing invasives from getting there to begin with is your best bet. The other thing is promoting perennial bunch grasses. So minimizing disturbances, that open spaces in the plant community is the best option for that. And so ironically, preventing, especially like I said, these lower elevations that are really prone to invasion, preventing them from burning to begin with is the best option. If you're going to be bringing in heavy equipment for one reason or another, minimizing it or knowing that you're likely going to experience some weeds moving in after the fact. And so just being mindful about how disturbance or how prone different sites in your property are to invasives, and then managing disturbance with that in mind. So we talked about fuel continuity. So that was the first fuel characteristic. The next fuel characteristic that we can manage for to reduce risk from wildfire is increasing fuel moisture. So I just alluded to this. Some plant communities, some sites are more resistant to invasives than others. They can outcompete them. These are higher elevation, wet sites, north-facing slopes. And high perennial bunch grass abundance to begin with is what limits the possibility of invasives establishing. So why do you want perennials rather than annuals? So we've saw in terms of fuel continuity that those perennials create these large interspaces, and also just lower fuel loads, lower fuel continuity, and so lower probability of fire, slowing moving fire. And then higher fuel moistures. So what management can you take to maintain or increase plant community resistance and increase fuel moisture? And so you want to manage for species with higher fuel moisture. And so again, perennial grasses retain moisture longer than annuals. Grazing can have a role in fuel moisture. And so during the growing season, moderate grazing can actually increase fuel moisture. And this is simply by, again, removing standing dead litter in the bunch grasses. And so the overall fuel moisture content of the bunch grass is actually increased when you remove through grazing the standing senesced material in the middle. These wolfy grasses, if they're grazed, they have increased fuel moisture later into the fire season. And so this figure demonstrates that. This was a fall-winter grazing study in southeastern Oregon. And so those open circles up top are where the grazing treatment was applied in winter. And those closed circles at the on that lower line are from ungrazed sites. And so it's really remarkable. We're looking at July, August, September, fire season in these areas. already those sites that the sites that have been grazed, start with a really high fuel moisture content, and they don't actually reach that fuel moisture of extinction, that red line where that fuel bed will be really receptive, to burning until midway through August. So one thing I like to caution people is obviously we're not going to graze our way into smaller, slower moving fires. But doing this strategically in important places around your property could be a good option. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes. The next aspect, the next fuel characteristic I want to talk about is managing hazardous fuels. And so thinking about those highly volatile fuels that create really big flames, create a lot of fire intensity, make fire response challenging. And so in general, and so this is kind of like, you're not going to graze all over to, you know, have green grass all year round or reduce fuel continuity everywhere. So in important places, for fire response or where you want to limit severe fire or, have reduced fire behavior, you want to manage, heavy fuels. And so juniper, sagebrush, these are the ones that can have some really big flames. And so you have a lot of options for this. How intent you should be on removing this vegetation really depends on your management objectives. And so if you have juniper, one thing people like to do is use juniper to line their driveways. It might look nice, but again, those are highly volatile. It's difficult to put out those fires. And so maybe you don't want them so close to your house. And so if juniper or brush are near your structures, maybe they're around your barn, but you're determined to keep them, just make sure they aren't in dense clusters. And so be thinking about if those canopies were to be burning, space them so that they can't readily transmit fire. They do put off a lot of embers when they burn. And so if you do have structures near, maybe some junipers that you'd really like to keep, think about fireproofing, features of your building. And so thinking more about the home ignition zone, would be a management option there. Going back to invasive annual grasses, if you remove juniper and shrubs, you might be opening up areas in the understory all of a sudden for your fine fuels. So grass might grow, that's a good thing. So just keep in mind that those fuels will still burn, but they will burn with lower severity, but they will still spread fire. And so thinking about these trade-offs is the important part here. And so again, the treatment you choose should reflect your management objective. One other thing that I like to remind folks is if you're talking about especially treating sagebrush, you might consult Oregon Department of Fisheries and Wildlife or your local wildlife agency to plan your fuels reduction treatment. They can help you think through the amount of removal or maybe a spatial pattern for the treatments. And so in terms of specific options, prescribed fire is really good for thinning juniper. So it can kill younger trees, but we really like it because it also decreases the seed bank, which mechanical thinning does not. And so a lot of you are probably dealing with encroaching juniper on your property. And so if the shrub and herbaceous component around the juniper is in good shape, and maybe you're on a north slope where it's a little wetter, consider prescribed fire and you might get some really great recovery, including some good grass growth in the following seasons. There are also a lot of mechanical treatments for juniper. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with them. So manual cutting, chainsaw is fairly common, masticators, feller bunchers. The downside to these options is it does miss the smaller trees, right? So in terms of fire, those aren't of immediate concern because they aren't going to produce 20-foot flame lengths. But if your management objective is also just to get rid of encroaching juniper on your property, it may not be the most cost-effective option. The other thing is when we're talking about bringing heavy equipment in is you might want to be thinking about how the impacts of the treatment, the disturbance it causes that heavy equipment what kind of consequences are it going to have? So manual cutting reduces ground disturbance very little, or excuse me, it doesn't create much disturbance. And so it's a good option if there is a completely depleted understory around your juniper, or if it's a site where you know that invasive annual grasses are likely to creep in once you remove the juniper. The other option, or not the other option, but if you're cutting juniper, keep in mind that they're still fuels even after the tree is cut down. And so, you know, options, especially if you're working with your soil and water conservation district, NRCS, you might be asked to lop and scatter, or you might be asked to pile burn. And so viewing these junipers as fuel, when you're lopping and scattering, you are rearranging fuels. So you might be creating some horizontal fuels. In contrast, if you're pile burning, you are reducing those fuels entirely. As far as treating sagebrush, same goes for juniper. So if the understory lacks perennial bunch grasses and there's a risk of invasives, but you're determined to thin your sagebrush, consider incorporating seeding with the mechanical treatment. And so when you're mowing, also reseed at the same time. Chemical treatments are also an option for sagebrush. But again, like the juniper, we want to be thinking about surface disturbance from something like wheel tracks of the spray rig, if you're applying herbicides on the ground. So aerial application would be a good option if you're particularly worried about disturbance, keeping in mind that when we do chemical treatments, it's going to leave some kind of vertical plant structure. So again, fuel, we will reduce the chemical component of that fuel because those leaves will fall off. But it is still fuel on the landscape. It might benefit wildlife, but again, having it there doesn't entirely reduce that risk. And so last thing, if you're thinking about reducing hazardous fuels in strategic places, just really emphasizing the need to evaluate, is there some kind of post-treatment needed? We don't want to thin hazardous fuels only to invite invasive annual grasses, and then you'll have a different kind of problem, right? And so in general, if you have a warm, dry site or later phase conifer stand, and so the way you know that is if it has a shaded out understory, so mostly bare soil underneath those canopies, they may need some kind of help after removing the trees. If there's a relatively high perennial and grass form component at the site before the treatment, then your recovery is actually probably going to be fine. The last management option I wanted to discuss as we're thinking about how our actions can influence those fuel characteristics and reduce our risk of fire. Fuel breaks are a good option, or creating just these lighter fuel areas on your property. So we just talked about managing hazardous fuels, and that is definitely a feature of creating fuel breaks. Several slides ago, I'd shown you that photo of a proposed fuel break in Eastern Harney County, where I am. And a hazardous fuel treatment is definitely needed to make that fuel break functional. Removing those junipers along the roadsides are what will make that route an option. And so fuel breaks in general, or creating these lighter fuel areas, your goal is to just disrupt that fuel continuity and reduce fuel loads in general. Remove volatile fuels, so like I said, cutting the juniper. And another option is seeding with plants or promoting plants that are going to have higher fuel moisture. And so a lot of times on Eastern Oregon rangelands, these are just going to be maintained roads, maybe 2 tracks, mowed areas, if there's a place that you disc annually, or vegetative green strips, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And then the width of any fuel break really just depends on the fuel type, the topography, slope, thinking about the potential flame lengths that a fire might generate. If you're thinking about putting a fuel break in on your property that might be used by fire professionals, that would be a great opportunity to reach out to the fire responders in your area, whether it's a rural fire district, a rangeland fire protection association, or even the BLM fire crews. And just engage with them, like what would they need for them to feel safe, and use that route during a wildfire event. And so the purpose of fuel breaks is first just to decrease fire starts off of roads. So a lot of fires, and increasingly, are human causes off of roadsides, from people dragging chains or idling vehicles. And so again, disrupting fuel continuity, reducing fuel loads, making it so that if a spark were to come off the road, it will land in a non-receptive fuel bed, essentially. The other function of fuel breaks that I really want to make sure people understand is they're not going to necessarily stop or put out a fire by themselves, but a good fuel break reduces fire behavior so that fire responders can effectively manage that fire. And so it could be putting the fire out off that fuel break, or it's making tactical decisions to, pinch off the larger wildfire. And so in this photo here, and this is from Southern Idaho, and it is somewhat of an extreme example, but this is a 2-lane road, and then that fuel break is enhanced by disking the roadside there on the one side. You can see there's sagebrush on the other side, but I can also see that there aren't invasive annual grasses amid the sagebrush. And so in terms of reducing fire starts, that's looking pretty good. In terms of other ideas for fuel breaks, if you're in an area where you might want to do green strips, these are created by seeding fire-resistant plant species. So an example of this, the Boise BLM plants forage kochia, so it stays green all fire season. It is very competitive with invasive annual grasses, and then it creates a lot of bare ground between plants. And then some folks have told me their cows eat it. So in general, this could be a good option on roadsides. Other options include crested or Siberian wheatgrass, keeping in mind that those are fairly tall stature grasses. So they are, going to burn in a somewhat exciting way. But again, the fuel continuity would be decreased there. Alfalfa is another option because again, it's going to be green all season long. You want to be selecting a species that can easily establish and persist. And again, the idea is that if a spark were to land in that fuel bed, it's going to be difficult to ignite. In this other photo here, and I took this in Western Harney County, they've mowed the sagebrush off the side of this 2-track. So this was just a ranch road through an allotment. And so in sagebrush, mowing is only needed once every 5 years to just keep the shrubs low. So again, the idea is you're not going to stop a fire, but you are going to decrease fire behavior so that fire can feasibly be managed. As far as grasses go, you're going to need to mow them annually. Though if you have the ability to keep animals concentrated in a strip, using, for example, a virtual fence or another option, livestock grazing is an excellent treatment for fine fuels along roadsides. You might follow up with chemical treatments to preclude invasive annual grasses or plant species that will exclude them, because again, the whole point is to make sure fires aren't started off this road, disrupt fuel continuity, reduce fuel loads. And so invasives would be counter to that goal. So I've just offered a lot of options for managing fuels, keeping those fuel characteristics in mind. Again, the main thing you can control when it comes to risk of ignition and how fires behave once they get going is managing fuels. And so a lot of this can be overwhelming. I know a lot of you have extensive properties, and so where on earth to start with your activities? So potential for rapid fire spread will affect your ability to respond to the fire and evacuate people, livestock. So we spent a ton of time discussing fuel characteristics to help you all start to think about things like, how would I expect fire to behave on my property? Or where on my property is risk of fire particularly prominent? What is particularly worrisome? And so Start by thinking about where your important assets are. So what are the fuel conditions, fuel characteristics in these areas, or options for options for accessing these areas? Are there a lot of hazardous fuels, again, next to your outbuildings? Is there high fuel continuity approaching the ranch? What are the things you can do to just moderate expected fire behavior? And so fuel modifications are those treatments and management activities that can moderate, so again, reduce fire behavior. So slower moving fires or smaller flame legs so that fire is more manageable. Due to weather and all kinds of things that are out of control, our best chance is these fuels management actions, and again, supporting effective fire response. So in terms of actions, so first off, maintaining defensible space around your home, your outbuilding, other infrastructure. So this is a buffer of non-combustible materials. The rule is 3 feet immediately around structures. And so that's bare mineral soil, rock. And then the 30 to 100 feet beyond that is ideally to be relatively devoid of highly combustible fuels, with the thought that blowing embers, when we get really big fires, we can get some intense winds. We want it so those embers are landing in non-receptive fuel beds, right? Agricultural assets such as feed, packing boxes, mulch, fuel supplies, these are particularly susceptible to flames and any wind-driven embers. So again, juniper, sagebrush, things we have on rangelands put off a lot of embers. And so ideally around those assets, you want to be thinking about around 100 feet clear of combustible materials. So again, that low or non-receptive fuels. Clearing vegetation around your equipment, maybe important pastures, thinking about creating safe havens for livestock if there were to be a wildfire event. So options for this, maybe you have some intensively managed grazing near your ranch house, barns, equipment areas. That can be defensible space for those assets, or it can create an area where livestock can go when there is a wildfire event. And then lastly, keep in mind that you don't have to and won't be able to do all these things at once, do all the areas at once, reduce all the hazardous fuels on your property. But again, thinking about how these fuel characteristics might influence the likelihood of fire, how fires behave when there is one, should start to inform your plan for carrying out these activities and then maintaining them in the long term. And so to just summarize kind of that fuels management section, what can we do to influence those fuel characteristics for better fire outcomes? So reducing fine fuels is going to decrease the likelihood that when there's an ignition, a fire is going to propagate. It also decreases the potential for fire spread. When we have lower fuel loads, higher fuel moisture, this means that we have that lower burn temperature. So I mentioned, the inner spaces don't get quite as hot during fires. And so we see some pretty good plant community recovery after those kinds of fires. Then in general, be thinking about removing hazardous fuels in important areas for fire response, decreasing spotting potential, and thinking about where you want to limit burn severity. So your assets, or maybe highly susceptible plant communities that are going to turn to invasives if they burn. And then lastly, fuel breaks or kind of light fuel areas are a really good option for protecting your assets, and then also really helpful for fire response in these remote places. And so we're going to shift a little bit. We're still in the before fire hits phase of things, but having a plan before the emergency is the ideal. So beyond fuel treatments, what else should you be thinking about before a wildfire threatens your property? This isn't an exhaustive list, but just, again, things to be thinking about. So first and probably foremost for many of you, protecting livestock. So answering some questions for your operation. I'm someone who likes to write things down or make a list. What do I need to figure out? What should others know about your operation? And so some of these questions might be, are my livestock in multiple locations at any point during the fire season? What are access issues to get to those locations if I need to move cows, for example? And so are these narrow roads that are difficult for stock trailers, or are you typically trailing cows in there? Thinking about inbound fire response resources, those are typically going to be bigger engines. Are they going to struggle getting there? Are there pastures for livestock to shelter in place if a fire were to occur? Or would you be thinking about evacuating them? If you need to be leaving your animals in place, are they going to have enough feed and water for several days? What will the livestock have water if the power were to go out? That's not uncommon during wildfire events. Some other, fairly obvious questions. Are your livestock branded and registered? Important to have those documents handy if there were to be an event. And then if you might be needing to move animals during a fire event. So what are your loading and unloading facilities? Where are they located relative to where your livestock are? Do you have a plan for gathering livestock if they were in, the summer pasture? Do the people involved, do they know the road system for accessing these pastures? And so, these aren't close-ended questions. These are food for thought and things to start to think through. Because again, we're in a fire-prone landscape. It's good to have thought about these prior to the emergency. The other thing that is important for landowners in particularly remote rural areas, that is a lot of Eastern Oregon, you might be supporting fire response. It might take a while for wildland firefighters to arrive at your property, or they may need some of your resources. So where are they located? Where is water distributed on your property? What are some things you might need to work on, develop, improve communications on? So the first question might be, do you have adequate water supplies for wetting down your buildings, facilities, or for directly fighting fire? This information is super helpful to have documented and share with other people. If you have to pump water, do you have a backup system in case you lose power? You may want to consider investing in a backup generator if you haven't, or have additional water storage, especially in southeastern Oregon where I am. Water is limiting in all kinds of ways, and in firefighting, that is definitely one of them. Thinking about if there were to be a fire event and wildland fire responders might be on or near your property, it's super helpful to clearly mark your water tanks, ponds, other water supplies. And again, this can just enhance fire response, right? If we want these folks to manage, put out these fires, let's do what we can to help them. And so keeping in mind a hard, durable road surface is needed within 10 feet of a water source for water tenders, large engines that a lot of the agencies and rural fire departments have. It can't be too steep, and they're not going to use it if it's wet or if there's loose soil. And so if you can, keep these sites clear of vegetation and debris that might make access difficult. And then the larger engines are going to need a 45-foot radius turnaround at or near the water storage. So it can be really helpful. Mark your water source, mark your turnaround, because otherwise they're going to have to get out and look around, and all of that is valuable time. Most engines and tenders are able to draft out of a creek, a stock pond, a trough, 2 feet of water. And so again, marking those. And then you might consider installing dual use tanks for fire and livestock. And there are, at least if you're in Oregon, there are Natural Resource Conservation Service programs for this purpose. The other thing, again, thinking about heavy equipment that's associated with fighting fire, Can your bridges handle fire engines or other fire suppression equipment? So posting bridge load limits and bridge heights can be really helpful if you anticipate those resources coming onto your property. And so as you start to think about these questions, you might write out a plan for yourself, also for sharing. This is an example developed by my OSU Extension colleague, Jacob Powell, of a ranch marking access routes, structures, and resources that might be useful if there were to be a fire event on this property. You could add to this a list of important phone numbers, maybe a picture of your brand, a map of pastures where your cows are located during the summer, maybe that safe haven if you think that your cows might be sheltering in place, if your livestock will be sheltering in place. You could put your fuel breaks or your light fuel areas on there, information about access roads. So again, are they going to be wide enough for heavy equipment? Hazardous areas people should stay away from. And then the other thing is documenting maybe your water sources, capacity, type of pump, is it electrical, gravity fed, gas, where it's located. And so again, mark the water sources themselves, but having it on a map could save everyone a lot of time as well. And so you could share maps, plans, inventories like that last one with, first of all, if you have any workers on your property, but also your neighbors, certainly local fire people, maybe with locations of copies of gate keys or a list of combinations if you have locked gates. And then a lot of you are grazing on multiple properties, so you're not always on the home ranch. So it's good to have a network of people sharing information if you're away from the home ranch during the fire season. Stating the obvious, but having phone numbers of your workers, neighboring ranches, who runs the cows or sheep in common with you or next to you can be really helpful. A phone tree for people to call if someone sees smoke can certainly be helpful. Do you have your local dispatch's phone number? Do you know how to report a fire? I mentioned this earlier, meeting with your local fire personnel prior to a fire incident. I know you're all busy, but that could be really helpful because then the first time you're meeting isn't during an emergency event. Another option that I highly encourage is talking with your range con, again, prior to a fire, about how and whether you'll receive wildfire notifications from that individual. Something definitely good to have figured out. The last thing is just keeping an eye out for weather alerts during fire season. And so you can get red flag warnings issued to your phone. So here, weather.gov/subscribe for your area. And red flag warnings is just all the ingredients are assembled for extreme fire behavior. And so the way I use this is there are certain activities that I'm not going to be doing on red flag days. I also find the forecast discussion useful on weather.gov when we're in the peak of fire season. And so lastly, let's say a fire is imminent. It's fire season, something's burning nearby. So, or a fire might start. So first off, watch for smoke, talk with your neighbors. Local radio, TV, they can provide good weather updates. The other thing I'll add is the FEMA app gives you real-time alerts from the National Weather Service. And so that's another option for signing up for community alerts in your area. The other thing during a fire event is you might receive alerts from the Emergency Alert System, the EAS, and Wireless Emergency Alert, WEA. And this doesn't require sign up. These are automatic messages to cell phones in within a set area. And so how do you know if that fire burning, a ways off is concerning? So you've heard me say fire behavior all evening long. This is how fire reacts to that fuel, weather, topography. The things we're thinking about are how big are the flames and how quickly is the fire moving? And so you should be concerned, first of all, if you see it, it's getting close. So you need to be thinking through, am I staying here? Are my livestock staying here? Hopefully you have a plan and you're keeping an eye on that. But tell folks you should be worried when you're seeing rapid spread through a fuel bed, large flame lengths. So maybe you're hearing traffic on the radio and you're hearing reports of that. That's definitely concerning. If it's further off, a really large smoke column is a good indicator that that's a fairly active fire. If you can see spotting, torching, crowning, fire whirls, so that's when fire gets into the canopy of things like trees and sagebrush, there's a lot of ember cast. That's when you need to be getting out of there. And so in general, fire behavior is telling you how hazardous is the situation and how quickly do I need to be getting out. But hopefully you're also communicating with fire responders if it's close enough that you can see this fire behavior. And so going back to the during fire, so again, maybe you see that smoke column a little ways off. You've been talking with folks in the area. It might be a good idea just to get ready. It could give you some peace of mind. So loading your vehicles with emergency supplies. Hopefully you've packed a go bag with important documents, kind of necessities for yourself, for your family, for your pets, valuables. And then maybe hook up your stock trailer. You might be loading your particularly valuable animals, your saddle horses, maybe your bulls. As far as your house goes, close all doors and windows. Embers can get in, and that is the most common way structures are lost during fire. It's not from the flaming front, it's from ember cast, and those embers getting into nooks and crannies of houses. The other thing we don't think about, turn on all lights in homes, barns, other structures. This helps fire responders see that there's a structure there. If you have time, turn off your propane tanks, turn on irrigation if you have it. Move your heavy equipment into non-vegetated areas, so mowed pastures, grazed pastures. And again, hopefully you've thought through where your livestock might need to weather this event. So ideally, previous grazed areas or low fuel pastures. The last thing to be doing throughout a fire event, communicating. So talking with your family, workers, neighbors, again, before the fire, but repeating where are your best evacuation routes if you do need to leave quickly. Keep in touch with your household about these routes, what your plans are. If you're gonna have a stock trailer, how wide is the road? Can you go this way while engines go this way? Things like that are pretty important. And so along those lines, communicating with fire personnel, if you have your maps and inventories of access points, livestock locations, give that to them. Ideally even the latitude and longitude of your livestock could be super important. Open gates, remove locks, give firefighters access if they're gonna be moving through your property. And then if you have too many animals to evacuate on short notice, thinking about feed and water for several days, you might take down temporary fences or other hazards that might injure livestock if a fire were to move through the property. And so again, it might be helpful to work with your local fire responders to determine how best to manage your remaining livestock if you're not able to evacuate them all. They might be able to give you information about, at least for the moment, because wildfires are rapidly changing situations, where exactly they think is a location that might avoid the fire. And so lastly, this is Oregon Department of Agriculture's resource page for agricultural producers. And there's some good stuff, so you can access it. I highlighted the link up there. And so there's information about animal sheltering during disasters, caring for livestock after a wildfire, finding animals that have been lost during wildfires, something that's painful to think about, but important, especially closer to Central Oregon. If you have livestock losses, where are those carcasses needing to go after a fire event? And so a lot of good resources there. And so the main thing I would like to leave you all with is we can't stop fires, right? What we can do is potentially reduce the likelihood that they occur on our property by managing fuels, influence how those fires behave in strategic places. And then again, having a plan before the event. I know it's painful and scary to think about, but our rangelands are prone to wildfires. They're getting larger, they're getting more frequent. And so thinking through these things in advance is the best advice I can give you. So I will wrap it up and I will check out the Q&A and see if we have questions. And thank you all for sharing what you do to get ready for fire.
Thank you, Katie. That was really good. I think every time I hear your talks, I always learn something new. Never thought about what you said about leaving the lights on. And in a situation with wildfires, that's, to me, very nice idea, right? Like, so people can see there's a structure there, like the firefighters. So very nice. I think we do have some questions or at least comments on the Q&A. So if you wanna, oh, no, they were all gone. I think we're just some questions and comments on responding to your question about at the beginning, what people are doing about preparing, managing fuels. So I do have a question. I think you mentioned earlier a little bit on, I'm sorry, I'm a little tired. Prescribed fire for juniper removal. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Like, what's the procedure here in Oregon? How someone can, I don't know if there's documentation required, approval required. So like more on the logistics side of doing it, time of the year.
Absolutely, and thanks for the question. This is actually a question I get from a lot of landowners. Can I burn my junipers? I think a lot of folks are dealing with junipers encroaching or moving down to lower elevations than where they've historically been. And so in terms of getting a permit, if you're burning on your property, no, you can go ahead and do that. Do not do it during fire season for the reasons we discussed. So even in the fall or spring, junipers, again, can create some pretty exciting fire behavior. Some prescribed fire to treat junipers has actually been a way a lot of the agency firefighters have done some training when they've first started out. So keep that in mind. But so typically, I recommend burning in the fall, and that's just because your fuels are going to be a lot more dried out than in the spring. And so one challenge with prescribed burning juniper, it depends on the phase of encroachment. And so where we have the really dense stands or stands that are dominating that plant community, and so they're kind of controlling the resources. And so the way we know that is the understories are fairly minimal. There's just sparse grasses in between these junipers. And so there's a functional challenge with prescribed burning, and that's just that a broadcast burn, so that's a fire moving through a landscape, is really challenging because you don't have those fine fuels to carry the fire through a stand of juniper. And so I'm helping a landowner plan a project this fall, or it'll be a couple falls, but some of the prep we're going to do this fall will actually be kind of a modified lop and scatter to address that. And so we're going to remove the top third of juniper trees and then put that in the spaces to help carry fire through the project area. The other thought is, in order to actually kill the juniper, which is a lot of people's treatment objective, that approach, so having kind of the fuels distributed on the ground, can create a lot more fire intensity than relying on kind of wind going moving fire from juniper canopy to juniper canopy. The other type of prescribed burning of juniper that is far more common than broadcast burn, which I just described, is mechanical cutting juniper, piling it, and then burning the piles. And so NRCS commonly provides technical assistance for that and also funding for that practice. They also do talk with your NRCS office about the broadcast burn option as well. But in terms of logistics and feasibility, a lot of times the pile burning is the direction folks go. The other thing is reach out to us at the Eastern Oregon Agricultural Research Center. That's where I am. And then we also have Dr. John Bates, who is very, very experienced in fire and juniper, if you're really keen to get after those junipers on your property. Appreciate the question, Juliana. Jennifer has another question from earlier, if you don't mind me just taking that.
Go ahead.
And so Jennifer's comment was she's heard some conflicting advice on shutting off the electricity and leaving the lights on when evacuating. So I think the shutting off the electricity conversation has probably come from the recent Westside fires and California fires, where some fires were started from the power lines. And so we've been hearing about the power shutoffs that might be happening during some fire seasons. So I'm not able to speak on whether there's a right one, but my thought is in remote Eastern Oregon, where I'm located, structures are a value that the agencies are meant to be protecting, and also so what again, I think the advice there is that you want them to know that your ranch is there. I think is the thought. Jennifer, I invite you, if you've heard other things on this topic, feel free to speak up. And I know you're in Western Oregon, where the conversation looks different.
Yeah, well, it just seems to be sometimes is when you're evacuating is to shut off the electricity for the whole farm. So I guess I'm just curious if leaving it on, because sometimes, the electricity is going to be running the pump, which is important for keeping water troughs filled if you're having livestock shelter in place. So I'm just trying to suss out, what is that, is there an additional hazard present if you do leave the power on at your farm or ranch?
And so the electricity shutoff guidance I've been hearing seems more targeted toward areas where there's a high likelihood that tree branches are going to be on those wires, and that's where we're going to see a lot of fire starts. I would be inclined leaving the electricity on because water, as you said, is going to be essential. I'm also not the expert on this, and I could ask around a bit and get back to this group if it's of a lot of interest.
Right, thanks.
Yeah,
Thanks for the question.
yeah, I think it really depends on the location, right? Like here in Eastern Oregon, that we don't have a lot of urban areas. It might be nice to have the lights on, just because then people can identify your property. And more urban areas, they know houses and all the infrastructure is there, right? So I think every place is a little bit different. And emergency situations will be always different in every single place. So I think it's always good to plan and be ready. Like you said earlier, plan, and be ready and make those connections. That's very valuable. I think we're good. I think there's no more questions. So thank you very much, Katie. I really appreciate it again. I think that's what we have for tonight. Tomorrow we have the last night left of the webinar series, and we're gonna have myself and Dr. Jennifer Cruikshank talking about a little bit of beef research update, what we have been doing this last year, and also a little bit on caring for livestock during wildfire situations, smoke exposure too. So I think that's it. I hope to see you guys tomorrow, and thank you very much. Have a good night.